It's Lawrence White, your host, with my co-pilot as always, Chris Newhart.
Heck yeah.
And today we have Devin D. Thorpe, who's running for Congress here in Utah, and social media influencer, lots of charity work.
Yeah,
For
it's
real.
great to be here. Thank you very much for having me, guys. It's a thrill.
For
Absolutely.
real. Appreciate you being here today with us.
Thank you.
Heck
Thank
yeah.
You. Yeah.
Yeah, we know a little bit about you. You're a champion of good, and could you tell people a little bit about who you are and where you've come from, and you've written so many books, you have your own show. I mean, it's just amazing all the stuff you've accomplished. Could you kind of let people know a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, really the place to start, I know it sounds crazy, but forgive me, but it's when I was about 11 years old. There was a flood up in southern Idaho. The Teton Dam failed near Rexburg, Idaho, and it left about 80% of the structures in Rexburg damaged or destroyed. It was a big, devastating flood. And people from all around the West went up to Rexburg that summer to kind of help people dig muck and mud out of their basements. And my dad came to me that summer and said, hey, Devin, I'm going up to Rexburg. Do you want to come? And it sounded like a good time to me, to go up to, dig in the mud. And so I went. I remember we got on buses about 2 o'clock in the morning with a big group of people and rode through the night, got there at dawn, worked all day, got back on the buses at dark and came home. And, I recently went back up to Rexburg to check, and I was looking for the statue that they built of me, and I couldn't find it. And so, I was convinced that I had completely changed the world by, doing this. And as I reflect on it now, I recognize I was probably in the way. I was a little kid. I couldn't really be much help, and yet they had to kind of take care of me and keep me out of trouble all day. So I did work hard for an 11-year-old kid, but I didn't have the capability to do much. So anyway, even though I probably didn't do any good, it was life-changing. And I left that experience with a vow that I would never miss an opportunity to help other people. Now, I did. I missed plenty of opportunities. I'm no saint. I grew up and I had a successful finance career. But nearly a decade ago, I got fired from the best job I'd ever had as a CFO for a global food and beverage company, and kind of channeled that idealism of my youth and launched a new career. I started writing books and articles about using money for good. And I kind of focused on 3 key areas: addressing climate change, poverty, and global health. Global health wasn't very interesting in the olden days. Now, all of a sudden, it's interesting. But anyway, I focused on those 3 problems. And at sort of the pinnacle, about a year ago, I had Bill Gates on my show.
Wow.
And it was really kind of cool to have Bill on the show. And I was genuinely excited about it. My friends were excited about it, and people talked about it. But after the show aired, I was kind of disappointed. I felt like I couldn't do anything cooler than have Bill Gates on the show, and I hadn't really changed the world. And so I began looking for a way to do more good, to have more impact. And I interviewed for some positions as the CEO of nonprofits, and I didn't hit. And I was struggling with what to do, and I finally hit on it over the winter. I recognized that I could run for Congress. And there I could have the influence I was looking to have. I could make the difference I wanted to make to advance the causes I care about in a way that would be more meaningful, more hands-on. So that's kind of my story. And it's too bad there's no more time left. I apologize. You're talking too much.
Well, first of all, I grew up in Southeast Idaho, so I remember those days. Well, a lot of people what year was that?
76.
76, yeah. So I was...
You were 2.
No, I was 5. I was actually 4 or 5 right there, yeah. But I remember a lot of people impacted by that, so that's amazing you brought that up. So,
Well, I'm glad to hear you're from that part of the country. That's beautiful country, and that was a really big moment in history for that community. And whenever I talk and tell the story to people from that part of the world, it resonates because that was a big deal.
That was pretty devastating too. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a lot more impactful than probably what most people picture in their mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a huge flood.
Yeah.
And I still have friends that bring that up from time to time, talk about it, and
Oh, sure.
their families went through it and everything. So
Yeah.
so the fact they bring it up it was reminiscent there
Yeah.
for a little bit.
Yeah.
So
That's
what
cool.
was so now you're obviously you've been in the corporate world, and then you've decided to move on to politics. Now, have you always been involved with politics, or?
Well, always no. Early in my career, I took a job working for Jake Garn, a Utah Republican senator on the Senate Banking Committee staff.
Mhm.
This is like 30 years ago, so I was a young guy, younger than Chris, a lot younger than Chris.
So did you grow up here then?
Yeah, I grew up here in Utah,
Oh, wow.
and but I went to Washington to work on the Senate Banking Committee staff there on Capitol Hill for a couple of years, and it was a really interesting experience. And I always figured, and there's certainly truth to this, just to understand kind of the way the sausage is made
Right.
is helpful in life, right? To understand Washington at a little better level. But I also recognized in that experience a number of things, but one of them was that the people who get to go onto the Senate floor and take a vote, or on the House floor, they actually do make a difference. And that impression was really vivid, and that has stayed with me all these years. But I've said a number of times to people that maybe no one was more surprised than I was that I actually ran, because I've been thinking about running for 30 years and just never did it. So, but I finally came home to roost. So.
That's awesome. Speaking of you doing stuff from such a young age, was there anyone that inspired you when you were younger that you looked up to? And then a follow-up to that, is there anyone that you kind of look up to nowadays that you're older?
Well, that's a great question. I have looked up to the President of the United States, who was president when I worked in Washington for a long time. That was George Herbert Walker Bush, the old Bush. And there are two reasons I have always looked up to him, and still do. He's not a perfect man, and I think if you've read enough history about all of our presidents, none of them were. We tend to come down on one side or the other with most presidents based on our politics, but the fact is none are perfect, and none are totally rotten either. But George Bush waged an incredible 110-day war, I think it was, on Iraq.
Right.
And then rather than take over the country like his son did, right? His son is the perfect model for why Dad did it right. And I think Dad may have influenced son to do that, which baffles me, because Dad did it right? He took back Kuwait and then said, okay, we're done. That was the job. Take back Kuwait. We're going to leave you alone. But if you do anything, you move a muscle, you twitch in the wrong direction, and we'll come get you.
Right.
And so we imposed the no-fly zone and all kinds of things, and we controlled Iraq for a generation. And then his son was elected president and decided, no, we need to fix that. And it wasn't a problem. But anyway, so that was one reason, that flawlessly executed war to liberate Kuwait. The other reason, which is a little more controversial, but George Bush got elected on the phrase, I promise, read my lips, no new taxes. And then push came to shove. The budget was not balanced. It wasn't working. He was a true fiscal conservative. And what did he do? He raised taxes. Some Republicans have described it as the largest tax increase in history. I don't know that that's really true, but it was a serious tax increase. And what resulted? Well, let's review. The years after that, when Bill Clinton was elected, because George Bush couldn't be reelected because he raised taxes. Bill Clinton enjoyed some of the most prosperous years in my lifetime in America's economy. And we had budget surpluses for so long in that decade that the federal government not only stopped issuing, well, it stopped issuing 30-year bonds. And we started to think that we would never see the federal government issue 30-year bonds again because we would only have deficits in times of recession. And so we would just issue short-term bonds.
Right.
Well, of course, again, George Bush Jr. came in and cut taxes, and we started running deficits during economic prosperity, and we've never gotten away with it. Then Donald Trump, of course, anyway, I'm getting a little too political, but I've always admired George Bush Sr. for being willing to sign off on that tax increase, knowing it would cost him in the election. He knew it. He couldn't have had any doubt about it, and yet he knew it was the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to do, and he did it. And I think, man, that's courage.
Right.
That's courage. And so I thought those two things, I've always been a big fan of George Bush Sr., and since I had the opportunity to work in Washington while he was there.
Well, that's and run as a Democrat, that says a lot. So
yeah, he just did it right. He did those two things right, and those were both really important things, right? So.
Well, I even remember too the Iraq War. I think I was 14 at the time. So that was the first time I ever saw us go through war.
Right.
So I was like, all of us were scared. Like, was it going to be a draft?
Yeah.
We were young kids. We didn't know what was going to happen. And it seemed like it was over as soon as it started. So,
yeah.
But that was a big deal at that time. I remember that well. So that was.
It was a very big deal, and of course it was an interesting moment in American history because it was the first war after CNN started.
Wow.
Oh, that's
so
right.
It was really the event that made CNN. Up to that point, it was boring, and no one could figure out why we wanted news on 24 hours a day.
Right.
But when the Iraq War happened, the first Iraq War happened, suddenly we go, oh, that's why we want news 24 hours a day, because it happens in real time. And so Wolf Blitzer was there in Baghdad, right. And it was some wild times.
That's when we had the brown paneling little box on our TVs.
Yeah.
We first had MTV. Woo!
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
The good old days. But yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was the first time I remember CNN hitting big and all that. And I totally spaced that until you mentioned it. But that was the time. Yep.
Is there anyone that you currently look up to now?
Well, certainly a lot of people. I'm a big fan of, and have long been a fan of, Barack Obama. I want to hasten to add, as I did with George Bush, he's not perfect, and I don't think he's perfect. But boy, the way he treated his wife, a faithful 30-year marriage is impressive. We have a guy who, during his whole administration, no one in his administration was indicted. You compare that to some of the other administrations. Reagan administration, there were lots of indictments. In the George Bush era, there was both George Bush. I mean, there have been a lot of indictments. Bill Clinton had some indictments. Bill Clinton was impeached. But Barack Obama manifested dignity in the White House that is really almost hard to find comparison with in my lifetime. He really did just present the image of what a president ought to be, I think. And I just irritated a whole bunch of your audience. But I hope they'll remember the part where I talked about what a good guy George Bush was.
Yeah, exactly. We balance it out, guys. We're not getting political. Relax. But I'll say this in defense of Obama. The one thing I like, too, is that there was that picture of him coming up and shaking hands with the janitor. So he treated everybody from top to bottom the same, which says a lot. My dad was the same way. So I look at that too. So that means a lot to me when I see somebody. It's like I don't care how much money you make. I don't care what you've succeeded. It's like us. We interview we go to conventions, we're interviewing security as much as we're interviewing stars,
Yeah.
And the
For
guys,
real.
we had one guy that got us through a lot of stuff in security.
Oh, that's great.
And so Chris automatically, hey, tell us about yourself. And he's like, you don't want to interview me? And I like, trust me, he does.
Yeah.
They got all the good stories,
Yeah.
and most of them they can't talk about.
Right.
But people appreciate that when you come at them that way, It's like,
Oh, sure.
I'm nobody. It's like, no, everybody's somebody. Yeah.
Yes, that is so true.
Yeah.
So true.
But yeah, we like to balance that as much as we can. But I like where you're
Yeah.
coming from when you're making those statements. Those are great. So
Yeah, for sure.
Heck yeah. And I was wondering, could you tell people, like, some of the other people that you've interviewed? You mentioned Bill Gates, but you've interviewed, I think, if I'm correct, Tony Robbins and, like, over 100 influential people. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, Tony Robbins was one who taught me a really important lesson about just being gracious. Because I interviewed Tony, and as we were wrapping up, I started to thank him and, close out the show. And he said, wait. I want to just take a minute and thank you for all the good you do in the world, for, you share these positive stories, and so much of the media is negative, and I really want to thank you for sharing those positive stories. And it stunned me, right? It really did. I mean, it just knocked me back. And, he'd probably been prepared, and, he's got people and things. But still, I was stunned that he took the time to call me out and thank me for doing what I was doing. And so I really value that lesson. And I was taught a similar lesson by Steve Young, the old football player from the 49ers.
that's my team.
Steve, I was, he's a big deal. He's still on television, I'm finding most people of a certain age, younger than I am, don't know who he is anymore. And that's too bad, because he's such a great guy.
Because I got hanging up on my walls everywhere in my house. You guys know me. I got my autograph, Steve Young.
Oh, that's good. I actually have an autographed Steve Young football, and so I was interviewing him, and there was a little miscommunication. I don't think his people prepared him well, and he was not prepared for what we were doing. Because we were going to do a video interview, and he was in a place where he could only do a phone call.
Oh.
And I didn't have a good way to connect in a phone call. And so we were kind of stressing this whole situation. How do we do it? So literally, I ended up putting my mobile phone on top of my autographed Steve Young football next to the microphone I was using. So we were basically both speaking into the microphone, and it was very Rube Goldberg, very amateur. It was embarrassing a little bit to me to have Steve Young on in this way, but he was so calm. He was so gracious. And I was guilty, and I'm still guilty of this at times, but I was guilty a lot consciously before that of thinking, I'm a big deal. Don't waste my time. If I invite you to be on my show, I expect you to show up and be ready. And watching how Steve Young behaved, and I was just like, oh man, I have been doing it wrong. If I think I'm a big deal, and Steve Young is gracious in the same kind of circumstance, I'm just a jerk. I'm not a big deal. I'm a jerk. And so it was one of those truly life-changing moments. I kid you not. I ran into him a couple of years later. I had an opportunity to go talk to him. He was helping to dedicate the LGBTQ house, the Encircle House down in Provo. And so I was there and had a... So I took the time to go tell him. I said, "You changed my life when you did my show."
So
of course,
beautiful.
He didn't remember being on my show. I mean,
And you are?
Yeah, I had no idea who I was. But I wanted to tell him because it was such a profound thing. I absolutely, from that day forward, tried to remember I am not a big deal.
Right.
The people who are doing the show are doing me a favor, and I need to be kind and gracious and patient and good to them. And boy, I tell you, it gets easier after a while to be nice to people if you actually try.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, wow. And so, it's been a huge help. And I'm excited that, Steve Young taught me to be a nicer person.
Yeah, he seems like a really cool guy.
Yeah,
I've never met him either, but I'm a big football fan, and yeah, he just seems like that's why I like the Niners, because they were always, even Montana and Jerry Rice, they're always talking about the team. It was like, I did this and I'm so great. Yeah. That's why I always liked them. They're like, it's a team effort. We all win together, and they're always modest. Yeah. And then they blow records apart. So yeah.
That's a beautiful story. And
well, everybody, we're gonna take a break right now, and we'll be right back. And you can get that burning question out.
Heck yeah.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. Legacy Talk, Lawrence White again with Chris Newhart and our guest, Devin Thorpe, who's awesome.
Well, thank you very much.
And the reason we're set up this way is because we want to make sure with the COVID, we're keeping our safe distance here. So if you ever see our set change like this, we've done it once before. So there's a method to our madness, trust me. So.
And one thing I want to ask you about is, could you tell people a little bit about the charity work that you do and what got you into that?
That's a great question. I really appreciate you asking, because when I launched my second career nearly a decade ago, the whole point was to solve big problems in society. And a fundamental principle, I believe, is that we all have a responsibility to be part of the solution. And some would argue I take that too far. I think there are arguments to be made. I don't take it far enough still for having preached that doctrine. But for instance, for years I didn't drive a car as a way of fighting climate change. Now I drive an electric car. I eat a vegan diet, right? Again, part of the motivation for that is it tends to be easier on the environment. So I really try to take personal responsibility for addressing world problems. And of course, one of the problems I care most about is poverty. And so I have done a couple of trips to far off places. Like I went to Nepal with an organization called Choice Humanitarian. Yeah. I also, a few years later, last summer, I went to Guatemala with Choice Humanitarian again. And on those trips, we help people in local villages, guided by them. We help them with the projects they want accomplished. We help them. We don't do it for them. It's a very collaborative, very local-led process. Choice does a great job.
So they have a stake of what they need to have done.
Right.
And then you rally around that.
So it's not, white people from the United States coming in and telling people, this is what you need, let us help you do this. And so it was great. Now, it was, the trip to Nepal was rather emotional for me in the end, because we went in March, I think it was 2014, if I'm remembering right. Mm-hmm. And in April was the big earthquake.
Oh.
And so we had been helping people install clean cook stoves in their homes. And many of those homes literally fell down, collapsed in the earthquake just a month later. So it was gut-wrenching to think about the devastation that they had experienced, because that made that Nepal earthquake so much more vivid for me, because it was people I knew, right? These were now friends that had experienced that. So that's one example. When I launched this new career, one of the first things I did was to join Rotary. And there are a lot of great service organizations, the Lions and Kiwanis and the rest, but I joined Rotary, and it's been a great experience. Rotarians are engaged in service from the micro level to the most macro. And so that's how I got involved in public health, really, was through Rotary, because Rotary's global initiative is to eradicate polio. And it is an amazingly difficult task. They have made incredible progress. In the 70s, individual Rotary clubs started working on this project, and after nearly a decade of clubs working on it, Rotary International adopted it as sort of its main focus in the 80s. And at that time, in the 80s, there were about 350,000 cases of polio every year. Right. And a case of polio is defined as resulting in paralysis. So you don't count as having had polio unless you get paralyzed. The irony is there are 200 actual cases of polio infections for every paralysis. So most people, so most people who get polio will have light symptoms. It's a little bit like COVID in that way, right? So with COVID, we're seeing that same phenomenon where most people are okay. They get it, they get sick, they have symptoms, they don't die, they don't end up in the hospital, but something like 5 or 10% end up in the hospital, and something on the order of 1% of people who get COVID die. It's horrible. So anyway, getting involved with Rotary gave me some real exposure to public health issues, and so I've been to Ethiopia, India, and Pakistan to do vaccinations of kids for polio, and it's amazing to see that work. And in all of those places, I met with World Health Organization officials and UNICEF officials and Rotary officials who are working on this, and it's been amazing to get to know and see them and understand. And so, wanting to avoid a little bit being political, but right now, the World Health Organization is sort of coming under some scrutiny, under some attack. And they may be guilty of having believed some Chinese propaganda. They may have screwed up. But there's no question in my mind that the World Health Organization is the primary actor for addressing COVID around the world. And so there's never been a time for us to be thinking about giving them more money, right? Because the global crisis we're having right now is the WHO's wheelhouse, right? And so we should be giving them more money now to deal with the biggest pandemic in 100 years. And so anyway, that experience over the last 8 years of working with Rotary and getting to know WHO has given me a little bit of a framework for understanding how global health works around the world. And WHO is like the centerpiece of that whole universe.
Well, regardless of COVID, I mean, like in Africa, there's how many lives are being saved with nets, mosquito nets that are saving lives there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much going on. I mean, the World Health Organization is overloaded anyways before COVID ever showed up on the scene. So I'm with you on that one.
We need to give them more resources. One of the interesting things, just to help balance this discussion, I want to be sensitive to maintaining a little bit of balance, but when I was in Africa, and I've been to visited 5 countries in Africa, and they're not overly huge fans of the United States, but it's interesting, they love George Bush Jr. more than they love Barack Obama.
Wow, I did not know that.
And the reason is George Bush Jr., and I gave him some crap earlier in the interview, but the fact is he did a couple of things that I quite like. One was Medicare Part D. That's the Medicare part that covers drugs. Right. Before George Bush, we didn't have drug coverage as part of Medicare, and as drug costs have gone up, it was devastating people. So he fixed that. So kudos to him for that. The other thing he did is he approved a program called PEPFAR that provided AIDS meds to people who couldn't afford it in Africa. That's right. And so he saved millions of lives with the stroke of a pen. And that is why he's a hero in Africa, because they recognize that he saved a lot of people on that continent. So anyway.
Wow. And it's amazing seeing how, like, when you're outside of the United States and you see how we're perceived.
Yeah, it's not always how we perceive ourselves.
Yeah. They're like, hey, does that media have that right?
Yeah.
And I just want to give you a special thank you for what you did with the Navajo Nation and raising stuff for them and everything, because not a lot of people look out for them and appreciate that. That was beautiful.
Well, thank you. It was really a great effort. Again, that involved Rotary. We partnered with Rotary on that, and Rotary was planning a trip to go down. And I think by my campaign getting involved, we probably were able to double. We got Karina Brown, who's running for lieutenant governor. She jumped in, and I think we probably doubled the amount of stuff Rotary might otherwise have taken down to the nation, maybe tripled it. But it was was great. We ended up with a 5-vehicle caravan, just everything packed to the gills, and took.
Can you
a ton of
elaborate
stuff.
on that? What was that situation?
Well, so of course, because of COVID, what we've seen is let me step back a couple of steps, but about 40% of the homes in the Navajo Nation lack access to running water, which is just a shocking fact. This is 2020, and of course, many homes also lack access to internet, access to electricity. And so if you're lacking in those things, it's not hard to imagine you are not able to implement sanitation the same way that folks on the Wasatch Frontier can. They can run the water for 20 seconds and wash their hands every 10 minutes, whatever. That's not the same deal on the Navajo Nation if you don't even have running water, right? Mm-hmm. So there was also an event early in the COVID crisis, very early in March, where they had a big rally, and it was a big religious rally, and people from all over the Navajo Nation went to this rally, and apparently there were some sick people there, and so people got infected there, and then went home everywhere around the whole Navajo Nation. Oh, no. And so again, all these things sort of synchronized. So anyway, by mid-April, it was clear that they were just being devastated by this. So they began shutting down the Navajo Nation. So they were kind of shutting down all the economic activity.
Right.
Even more so than we were in the rest of the country. And so without any activity, I mean, there literally was just no food for a lot of people, and no way to get food, right? They weren't allowed to travel. So, I mean, it was just a mess. So people began, and a lot of people helped in a lot of different ways. It wasn't just me, and it wasn't just Rotary, but among the many people who delivered emergency supplies, food, and PPE kinds of things, gloves and masks and all the rest. So we took some stuff down of it. We spent about 3 or 4 weeks organizing, gathering material, and then we hauled it down over Memorial Day weekend in May. And like I say, we delivered, we didn't weigh it all, but it was between 5 and 10 tons of emergency supplies, and it was a big deal.
Heck yeah, greatly appreciate you being a part of that and organizing that, and everyone that was the team that helped do that.
Thank you. It was an honor to be a part of that, and I'm proud of my Rotary friends for organizing that, and glad that we could help.
Well, that's good, especially now, because my job before about a year ago was we sold a lot of PPE stuff, and during this crisis, I got a hold of everybody I worked with, and a bunch of friends, and they're just like, we don't have any, we don't have N95 masks, we don't have, everything's sold out for 2 years, and they can't keep up with the demand. So, in this time of crisis, it's like, what happens when we don't have these things?
Yeah.
So anybody that can help anybody, PPE, food, anything, it's a huge deal. Yeah. Good for you.
Heck yeah.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, what's some advice that you give to people that are trying to follow in your footsteps, literally, trying to change the world and trying to just be a better person, be the change that you want to be? Like, what's some advice you give to someone that's trying to do that? Because I know I definitely look up to you and want to aspire to.
Thank you.
And you're not going small. We're not, this is a little, this is, it's not like me how to be a good comic book writer. Yeah. You're talking, well, your goals are a little higher.
There are 2 ways to think about this, and I would encourage people to think about them in both ways, even though they seem like they're opposite approaches. But one way is to recognize that it starts by helping the person right in front of us. Right? It is taking responsibility for the one that we have the opportunity to serve right now. I think that's important. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that having done that, we're not done, right?
Right.
And there is a temptation that we all feel when we've done something good to say, I've done my part. But we have to, on the other side, recognize that some of these problems in the world have scale, right? Mm-hmm. There are in this country about 500,000 homeless people. right? So when we help one a little bit, we haven't solved homelessness, right? We've got to think about the problem at scale. How do we address that? And it's tricky. Smart people are thinking a lot about that problem, for instance. And so I'm not going to say it's just, you sometimes hear people talk about these things as if all they require is a little more political will. And homelessness is one where I would say that is not the case. It takes more than a little political will. It takes a lot of effort. It's going to take coordinated, consolidated, massive effort to really solve homelessness.
I think that's part of the problem. And saying it to a politician, that's even funnier what I'm going to say right now. But I think we get to the point that we have to politicize everything, even the virus. Once I think we politicize it, we're losing touch with what the problem is.
Yeah.
And we can't do that. You got to look at it like, what would a human do to
for another human?
Yeah, for another human, exactly.
It's such a good point, and it is so tempting to try and politicize everything. And off camera a bit ago, we were talking a little bit about this tendency we have now to choose our own facts or make up our own facts.
Right.
And Kellyanne Conway said somewhat notoriously right after the president was inaugurated that we have alternative facts, right? And so she's been pilloried in the press for this comment about alternative facts. Mm-hmm. But she's exactly right. She didn't mean that Republicans make up their own facts. What she meant was that if you look at the total universe of facts, some facts support one case and some facts support another case, and we all tend to choose the facts that support the case, our political agenda. Mm-hmm. And that is part of our fundamental problem, is we've politicized facts. That's right. Now, and we've got to get back to some way of reconciling those facts. But as we think about that goal of getting back to a fundamental agreed upon fact set would guide us in how we deal with social problems that are challenging, like homelessness. Mm-hmm. I do tend to believe, Chris, you were asking, how to follow in my footsteps, which is anyway, we won't go there. Following someone better than me's footsteps, but I think we can take personal responsibility for climate change. You can drive less or drive a more efficient car, and there are things that we can do. Eating less meat, for instance, helps the environment. But the scale of that problem is so big that we also have to be thinking about what corporations and governments are doing in terms of policy and their activities as well. It isn't enough, but I would never abdicate. There are some people some environmentalists who kind of say, it doesn't matter what I do. I'll drive a Suburban because it doesn't matter. One Suburban isn't the problem. The problem is that there are 100,000 or 1 million Suburbans on the road. That's the problem. Right. And I don't believe that. I think what I do matters, even if it's only a matter of principle. What I do matters. But we do also have to address climate change. That there was one of the meteorologists in town. Thought it was interesting. He was asked at a Rotary Club meeting as a scientist what he believed about climate change, and he made, and I'm not going to call him out by name, but he made what to me was an absurd statement. He said, I believe climate change is true, but we shouldn't politicize it. And to me, that was total abdication. I mean, it sounds nice that we shouldn't politicize it, but to not politicize climate change is to not do anything about it, right? That's really what he was saying. I believe it's a problem. I just don't think the government should make any rules that inconvenience me to address a problem that could potentially threaten the species of human beings, right? Right. And I'm thinking maybe we should at least have a conversation about what policies ought to be, and that is going to be inherently political. We're going to have the hard conversation.
But I think there's two ways you can look at it. If you want to politicize it, like to find solution, that's one way. But if you want to politicize it to one party to win and another party, then it becomes asinine. It's just a waste of time. That's the way I look at it. Yeah. So
when I was in Washington back in the 80s, 89 to 91, I came home just stunned at how partisan politics was at the time. I look back on it now, and those were like the halcyon days of bipartisanship. It was shortly after that Orrin Hatch, arch conservative, and Ted Kennedy, consummate liberal, got together to pass a legislation called CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, right? That bill, passed in the early 90s, has saved countless lives. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives by ensuring that poor kids had health insurance and could go see a doctor and get care even if their parents couldn't. Now, I would be in favor of doing more, but they did that at a time when that was revolutionary. And it was a Utah Mormon who said, you know what, there are a lot of poor kids in my state. We need to take care of them. And Ted Kennedy, who was, the consummate liberal, who's saying, I care about all kids everywhere. And they came together and they did this. So we have stopped doing that over the last decade or so, especially in the United States Senate. But emanating from there is this general pervasive point that you make so well, that we have stopped collaborating and working for bipartisan solutions, and instead we call it a victory when we prevent the other side from succeeding, right, even if we would be better off.
And nobody wins. That's our problem with our system. I mean, I got a long, strong views, so I got to bite my tongue a little bit. But yes, it's if your sole purpose is to make sure the other side loses, we all lose. That's the way I look at it. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on.
It's exactly true. And both sides have been guilty of that over the last decade. And a lot of my liberal friends will say that the Republicans started it. Mm-hmm. And that may or may not be true. But the fact is, we're both doing it now. The Senate is almost dysfunctional.
Arguing that.
Yeah, the good news here is that, I'm just going to use a couple of lightning words here, but Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, I don't know that they ever met or spoke on this, but they came together with their disparate camps to pass the CARES Act in April, and they created this $2 trillion package of emergency COVID relief. Now, this has been devastating for our country, but can you imagine how much worse it would have been without the CARES Act? Can you imagine?
Right.
And so that was... We demonstrated that in this moment of crisis, there was some ability left in our country for bipartisan solutions. And that is a key takeaway that we've got to remember, because that's where real solutions lie, is in coming together in the middle and solving our problems.
And there may be hope yet.
Yes, there is hope. There is hope, for sure.
With that, we'll just got to go to a commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everybody. Legacy Talk, and again, we're here with Devin D. Thorpe. And Devin, where can everybody reach you at?
Well, I'm wherever you are, so that's the thing. So I'm going to give you a long list. But only pay attention to things that are relevant to you. Ignore everything else. So everyone's on the internet. So make a note: DevinThorpe.com, DevinThorpe.com. I'm on Twitter at Devin D. Thorpe. I'm on Instagram with the same handle, at Devin D. Thorpe. I'm on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Devin Thorpe. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/Devin Thorpe, or facebook.com Devin Thorpe for Congress. So I think those are the... Oh, YouTube. Don't forget on YouTube, youtube.com/Devin Thorpe. So,
heck yeah, we'll make sure that we put all the links and all that for you guys.
Well, thank you.
You got to be at the end of this broadcast here. So
fantastic.
Devin, it was great having you here, man.
Thank you. It's been a thrill. It's been thrilled to connect. You guys are so nice to have me. I'm so grateful. You guys do amazing work. I know you have people on the show all the time who are a much bigger deal than I am, and I'm honored that you'd include me. It's so fun to talk to you guys. Chris and I go back for a long time. We're good friends, and I'm grateful that Chris Chris is such a fan, and I'm such a fan of your work, Chris. Thank you for all the fun you're creating in the world, man. You're just an inspiration of positivity.
I appreciate that.
He is, isn't he?
Yeah, for sure. Lawrence, great to meet you.
Yeah, you
Thank
too. It was great meeting you today.
For real, I love you, Devin. It's great having you on the show, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and much love and respect.
Peace out.